The sun had just begun to sink behind the hills when the man turned his truck down the gravel road that led to his land. Dust swirled behind him, the familiar crunch of stone under his tires a sound he had heard every day for years. But tonight, something was different. His eyes narrowed as he slowed the truck, the silhouette of his fence line ahead looking broken, jagged where it should have been straight. He pulled up to the edge and stepped out, his boots landing heavy on the dirt. What he saw made his chest tighten, not with anger, but with something quieter, something colder. The wooden posts that had stood for decades were cut, hacked through with clean blows, and pieces of wire fencing lay twisted on the ground. Beyond the broken line, the earth was torn apart, muddy trenches carved deep through the soil, stretching across his fields like ugly scars. Thick black pipes had been laid in the trenches, their shiny surfaces cutting through the natural earth like snakes. They ran far across his land, connecting somewhere beyond the horizon. He crouched, pressing a hand to the dirt. It was still wet, the mud fresh, meaning this had happened only hours ago. His eyes scanned the ground, noticing the heavy tire tracks left behind by construction vehicles, the muddy boot prints of workers who had done their job quickly and left without care. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. This was no accident. No neighbor would dare cut his fence. No farmer would dig trenches across another man's field without asking. This was deliberate, bold, and smug. And in this neighborhood, there was only one group bold enough to believe they could do such a thing without consequence. The HOA. The sound of hushed voices carried from down the road. He turned and saw two neighbors standing near their porch, watching him. Their faces held the same look, nervous curiosity, mixed with a fear they did not speak aloud. One of them called out softly, almost as if afraid of being heard by others. We saw them here earlier, the neighbor said. Trucks, men in uniforms. They said it was authorized work. HOA business. They didn't even ask permission. They just cut through. The other neighbor shook his head quickly, lowering his voice. Be careful. Don't fight them. They'll bury you in fines if you push back. Everyone knows it. The man gave them a single nod, his face calm. He didn't ask questions. He didn't shout. He simply turned back to the broken fence, his eyes sweeping across the land that had been scarred without his consent. His silence unnerved them. Neighbors expected rage, yelling, threats of police. Instead, they saw a man who stood still as stone, his eyes calm, his body steady, as though the destruction meant nothing. But it meant everything. He walked slowly along the trench, his boots sinking slightly in the wet soil. The pipes gleamed in the fading light, running like veins through his land. He followed their path across the fields, his mind quiet, his thoughts locked behind an expression that gave away nothing. The HOA had grown arrogant over the years. They fined families for paint colors, threatened to tow cars parked an inch too close to sidewalks, sent letters about lawns, mailboxes, even curtains. But this was different. This was not about appearances or petty rules. This was about control. Control of water. Control of land. Control of him. He stopped at the far edge where the trench disappeared into the tree line. The pipe vanished into the shadows of the forest, heading toward the heart of the neighborhood. His eyes stayed fixed on it, unblinking, as the last of the sunlight faded. Behind him, the neighbors whispered again, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Why isn't he angry? Why isn't he calling the police? Why is he so quiet? The man turned and began walking back toward his truck, his movements unhurried, his shoulders steady. He did not answer their questions. He did not speak a single word. His silence was heavier than anger, heavier than threats, heavier than any outburst. It was the silence of a man who was already thinking beyond the damage, beyond the insult. It was the silence of a man who knew something the others did not. When he reached the truck, he leaned against it, pulling a folded map from the glove box. The paper was old, its edges yellowed, the ink faded but still clear. His father's handwriting marked certain places, notes written in neat strokes. The map showed not only his land but the land beyond, the hills, the forests, and most importantly, the water lines hidden beneath them. His father had once told him a simple truth: water is power. Never forget where it comes from. The HOA thought they had power now, with their pipes and their arrogance. But they had no idea what he held in his hands. He folded the map again and tucked it away, his eyes moving once more across his broken fence. The smoke from his neighbor's chimney curled into the night sky, the sound of crickets filled the air, and the cut wires glinted in the last traces of daylight. He stood there for a long time, silent, steady, unbroken. The HOA had made their move. They had cut his fence, carved his fields, laid their pipes across his land without fear. They believed they controlled him now. But the man's calm face told a different story. He was not defeated. He was waiting. And when the time came, they would learn that control did not belong to those who shouted the loudest. It belonged to the one who held the source. The next morning, the man was outside early, standing near the broken fence, watching as the sunlight touched the muddy trenches that had torn through his land. Birds sang in the distance, but their song was drowned out by the distant rumble of engines. Soon, the sound grew louder, and 3 black SUVs pulled up at the end of his driveway. Their polished surfaces gleamed under the sun, and the HOA crest was displayed boldly on their doors as if they were some kind of law enforcement. Out stepped Richard Cole, the HOA president, his suit too sharp for the country road, his sunglasses glinting as he smiled with the confidence of someone who believed he owned everything he could see. Behind him came Davis, the HOA's enforcer, a heavy-set man with a folder under his arm, and Linda, the treasurer, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. They walked across the dirt, their shoes sinking into the soft ground, wrinkling their noses at the mud as if it offended them. Richard stopped a few feet from the man, pulling off his sunglasses slowly. "Good morning," he said, his tone smug, like a teacher scolding a child. "I suppose you've noticed the improvements we've made." His hand gestured toward the trenches, the pipes that cut through the land as if they belonged there. The man said nothing. He only watched, his face unreadable. Richard smirked at the silence, mistaking it for fear. "You see, this community needs water. Our resort needs supply. The board voted, and it was decided that your land was the most efficient route. It's nothing personal, of course. Just business. Community business." Davis opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, his voice loud as he began to read. According to Section 14 of the HOA Charter, any land within community borders may be used for essential infrastructure. Fences, gates, or personal property interfering with such projects will be considered violations. Violations will result in fines, effective immediately. He smirked as he glanced up from the paper. "And in your case, the total fine already stands at $20,000. Neighbors had begun to gather along the road, drawn by the arrival of the SUVs. They stood in small groups, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between the board and the man. Some looked nervous, others angry, but none dared step forward. Richard noticed them too, and his voice rose so they could all hear. "This is what happens when someone resists progress. This land isn't just yours, it's part of the community, and the community has spoken. These pipes will stay. And if you don't like it," he smiled wider, "well, you'll find that resistance only makes things worse." Linda scribbled something on her clipboard, her pen moving fast, her lips pursed in satisfaction. "Additional fines can be issued daily," she said loudly. "By the time we're done, you won't even be able to pay the interest." Laughter rippled among the board members, their arrogance filling the morning air like poison. But the man didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes calm as he listened to their words. His silence unsettled a few of the neighbors. One of them whispered, "Why isn't he fighting back? Why doesn't he tell them to leave?" Another shook their head nervously. "Don't you see? He's smarter than that. He's planning something." Richard stepped closer now, his smile thinning as if he were daring the man to react. "You can glare all you want, but you're outnumbered, outvoted, and out of luck. We own this land now, at least the parts that matter. You might still live here, but make no mistake, you live under us." Davis shoved the papers into the man's chest, But the man didn't flinch. He let the folder fall into the mud without so much as a blink. A murmur ran through the crowd. Richard's face twitched, his smug mask cracking for just a second, but he quickly recovered, throwing his arm around Davis's shoulder. "Let's go. We've wasted enough time here. He knows his place now." The board turned back toward their SUVs, laughing and congratulating themselves. Davis muttered something about draining him dry with fines, while Linda talked about how much money the resort would make with its new water supply. Richard glanced back one last time, hoping to see anger on the man's face. But there was none. Only calm, steady silence. The neighbors stayed even after the SUVs rolled away in a cloud of dust. They whispered among themselves, watching the man as he crouched by the broken fence, brushing dirt from a piece of pipe. His calmness unsettled them more than any outburst could have. They could see it in his eyes. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Waiting for something none of them could yet see. That night the man sat alone in his kitchen, the broken fence and muddy trenches still fresh in his mind. The house was quiet, only the faint hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall filling the silence. He spread the folder of papers the HOA had shoved at him across the table. Their words were bold, full of threats and fines, stamped with the arrogant seal of the board. He read them slowly, carefully, his face calm as always. When he was finished, he pushed the folder aside, letting it fall half off the table, and reached instead for the old box sitting on the shelf. It was wooden, scratched from years of use, with his father's initials carved faintly on the top. He pulled it down and set it on the table, the dust rising like smoke in the dim light. Inside were maps, notebooks, old photographs, pieces of history his father had kept safe. His father had been a practical man, one who understood land better than anyone else. When the HOA was nothing more than a whisper, his father had already known how greed would grow, how land would be carved up and sold to those who never worked a day in the dirt. "Remember this land," his father used to say. "It remembers you." The man pulled out the largest map, unfolding it across the table. The paper was yellowed with age, edges torn, but the ink was still strong. He traced the lines with his fingers, the rivers, the hills, the valleys, and then the faint markings of underground systems. His father had once worked with surveyors when the water lines were first built, and here, in careful detail, was the truth most had forgotten. The HOA's pipes, freshly cut and proudly laid, were nothing more than branches on a tree. The root lay elsewhere. The man's finger stopped at the drawing of a mountain spring far above the neighborhood, marked with a small black X. Notes scrawled beside it read, "Primary source, natural flow, ownership contested but transferable." His eyes narrowed slightly. Ownership contested. Transferable. The HOA had built their resort lake, their fountains, their pools, all off the assumption that the community owned the water. But they had never bothered to check the original rights. They assumed power because they had money, because they shouted the loudest. But the truth was written here in faded ink. The spring did not belong to them. It could still be bought. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, the ticking of the clock suddenly loud in the silence. His father's voice came back to him, as though carried on the still night air. "Water is power. Always know who holds it." He folded the map carefully and slid it into a leather folder of his own, locking it inside his desk drawer. His calm expression never broke, but in his chest a fire stirred. Outside, the night deepened, the crickets growing louder, the stars stretching far above. Across the neighborhood, the HOA board likely sat in their bright houses, glasses of wine in their hands, laughing about the man they thought they had crushed. They didn't know he sat here now with the truth in his hands, the kind of truth that could drown them in their own arrogance. He stood and walked to the window, staring out across his land. The trenches looked like scars, the pipes like veins trying to steal what did not belong to them. But he no longer saw them as loss. He saw them as a line leading back to the source. He thought of Richard's smug smile, Davis's threats, Linda's scribbled notes. They believed fines and papers could bury him. But soon, they would learn what real power was. They would learn what silence had been hiding all along. He turned from the window, picked up the old box, and placed it back on the shelf with care. Tomorrow, he would begin the process. Tomorrow, he would set the trap. Tonight, he let the silence sit heavy, unbroken, the weight of coming justice filling the air. The days that followed were filled with noise, not on the man's land but across the neighborhood. Trucks rumbled through the streets, workers shouted, machinery roared. The pipes that had been buried through his fields were now connected openly to the HOA's grand projects. On the resort side of the lake, fountains shot arcs of water high into the air, sparkling in the sunlight as if mocking the silence of the man's farm. Children played in new sprinklers that stretched across manicured lawns, their laughter carrying across the valley, while HOA board members stood proudly at the clubhouse, shaking hands with developers and contractors. To them, it was victory. To the man, it was only arrogance on display. Richard Cole stood at the front steps of the clubhouse. Reporters gathered around as he gave a speech about progress. His suit gleamed, his voice rang with false confidence. Today, he said loudly, we prove what true leadership means. Our community is thriving because of these improvements. We have secured water for our future, for our families, for our prosperity. And no one, can stand in the way of progress. Applause followed, though not all of it was genuine. Some neighbors clapped out of fear, others out of habit, their eyes darting nervously to the quiet house at the edge of the community. They whispered to each other, wondering why he hadn't acted, why he hadn't fought. Maybe he gave up, one said softly. Maybe he knows he can't win. But another shook his head. No. Look at him. He's not broken. He's waiting. You can feel it. At the edge of the crowd, the man stood in silence, his boots dusty, his hands in his pockets, watching the fountains spray into the sky. He said nothing, his expression calm, his eyes locked on Richard's smug grin. Richard noticed him and raised his voice louder, as though taunting him. Some people don't understand what it means to be part of a community. Some people think their land is separate, that they can stand against the will of the majority. But look around you. We are united, and we are stronger because of it. Davis clapped hard, his laughter echoing. United, except for one stubborn fool who thinks rules don't apply to him. Linda scribbled notes in her ledger, smirking as she calculated how much money the HOA would make with their new water features. How many fines could be piled on the man until he broke completely. The crowd dispersed after the speeches, neighbors wandering home, some excited, some uneasy. The man stayed until the last of them were gone, his eyes scanning the sparkling fountains, the full pool at the clubhouse, the sprinklers across the lawns. To most, it looked like strength. To him, it looked like overconfidence. That night, the board celebrated. The clubhouse lights glowed bright against the dark sky. Music spilled into the streets, glasses clinked, and voices laughed deep into the night. Richard toasted their success, his face red with wine. We've secured our legacy, he boasted. No one will remember the barn. No one will care about one man's fields. They'll remember the lake, the fountains, the beauty we built. Davis leaned back in his chair, chuckling. And if he still thinks he can fight us, we'll bury him in more fines. By the time we're done, he'll wish he'd left years ago. Linda raised her glass. To control, she said simply, her eyes sharp, her voice cold. They all drank, their laughter echoing into the night. But across the fields, in the small, dark house at the edge of town, the man sat quietly at his table. The map was open before him again, his father's notes glowing under the lamplight. His finger rested on the black X marking the spring, the source that none of them had remembered, the heart of everything they claimed to control. He closed the map, his eyes calm, his jaw set. The HOA believed they had one. They believed their fountains, their pools, their water features were proof of their power. But the man knew better. He knew power was not in the pipes or the trenches or the fines. It was in the source. And the source could be his. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of wood the only sound in the quiet house. Outside, the glow of the clubhouse shimmered on the horizon, laughter carrying across the dark. He listened, not with anger, not with fear, but with patience. For every glass they raised, For every arrogant word they spoke, their downfall grew closer. They thought his silence meant defeat. But it was not silence of a broken man. It was silence of a storm waiting to break. The morning was gray and cool when the man drove into town, the old truck rattling as it rolled down the cracked pavement toward the courthouse. He did not rush. He never rushed. The courthouse was a plain brick building, old and steady, with tall steps that had been worn smooth by decades of boots and shoes climbing them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust, the quiet echo of footsteps bouncing off the high ceilings. Clerks sat behind desks stacked with files, the shuffle of papers and the clack of typewriters filling the silence. The man walked with slow, steady steps, his boots leaving faint prints of dried mud on the polished floor. He approached the records office, a narrow room lined with shelves and cabinets, and handed the clerk a small slip of paper with a simple request. She looked at him strangely, her eyes flicking to the mud on his boots, but said nothing. She disappeared into the back and returned with a file so old it was tied with string. The man untied it carefully, his rough hands surprisingly gentle with the brittle paper. Inside were the original water rights documents, yellowed and faded but still legible. They spoke of the spring, high in the mountains, the natural flow that fed the streams that fed the lake that the HOA had built their empire upon. Ownership had passed through hands long forgotten, claimed but never fully secured, contested but never locked down. His father had known. That was why he had marked it on the map. And now, the man knew too. The clerk cleared her throat nervously. You know, sir, this isn't common property. This can still be bought. But it's complicated. It isn't cheap. He met her eyes calmly. How much? She named a number, one that would make most men hesitate, one that would have broken families in debt. But the man didn't flinch. He pulled out a leather folder from under his coat and slid it across the counter. Inside were bonds, savings, investments his father had set aside, money the man had never touched until now. He had waited for the right moment, the right reason. This was it. The clerk's eyes widened as she counted, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. This is enough. She looked back at him, searching for doubt in his face, but found none. Then draw up the transfer, he said simply. Hours later, after signatures were written and seals pressed into the paper, the man walked out of the courthouse with a thin folder under his arm. Inside was the proof of ownership, the legal stamp that no one could deny. The mountain spring, the source of every pipe, every fountain, every drop the HOA bragged about, was his. He walked back down the courthouse steps slowly, the weight of the folder light compared to the weight of what it meant. The town bustled around him, people going about their day, unaware that something monumental had just shifted. To them, he was just a quiet man in worn boots, a farmer with mud on his hands. But hidden inside his folder was a weapon stronger than fire or fines. The drive back home was long, the road winding through fields and forests, the sky clearing as the sun broke through the clouds. His truck rattled as always, but his grip on the steering wheel was steady. He passed neighbors working in their yards, children chasing each other near the road, dogs barking at the tires. None of them knew. Not yet. At the edge of his property, he parked the truck and carried the folder inside his house. He set it down on the table, beside the old maps his father had drawn. He opened it, laying the new documents side by side with the old ones. The faded ink of the past met the fresh stamp of the present, and together they told the story. The source was his, and always should have been. He leaned back in his chair, his face calm, his eyes steady. Outside, across the lake, he could hear the faint sound of fountains spraying, children laughing in the resort pool, the HOA celebrating their supposed victory. Richard and Davis were likely raising glasses of wine, Linda counting numbers on her clipboard, all smug in their belief that they had broken him. But they didn't know. They didn't know that with a single twist, a single decision, all of it could vanish. They didn't know the ground they stood on had already been taken from them. The man closed the folder gently, slid it into his drawer, and locked it with a key. He stood, walking slowly to the window. The trenches still scarred his fields, the pipes still cut through his land. But instead of anger, he felt patience. He had no need to strike yet. Not until the moment was right. The HOA thought they controlled everything. But he controlled the source. And when the time came, they would learn what true power was. He watched the setting sun turn the lake gold, the fountains sparkling in the light, the clubhouse glowing with pride. His jaw tightened, his silence steady. They thought they had won. But their victory was built on water that no longer belonged to them. The summer sun beat down hard on the neighborhood, the kind of day where the air shimmered above the asphalt and even the birds grew quiet in the heat. Children splashed in the resort pool, sprinklers sprayed arcs of water over the manicured lawns, and the grand fountain outside the clubhouse sparkled in the sunlight. For the HOA, it was another day of pride, another day to boast about their control of the community's resources. Richard stood on the clubhouse balcony, a glass of chilled wine in his hand, watching the water jets rise and fall. Davis sat nearby, fanning himself lazily, while Linda scribbled figures into her ledger, calculating how much profit they could show at the next board meeting. "You see," Richard said loudly, his voice carrying to the guests below, "this is what leadership looks like. We provide. We build. We sustain. And no one, not a single stubborn farmer, can stand in the way of that." His words were met with polite applause, though more out of habit than true belief. But just as his smile widened, the first sign of trouble appeared. The fountain sputtered. At first, it was only a hiccup, a brief stutter in the graceful arc of water. Richard laughed it off, raising his glass. "A minor glitch," he said with forced cheer. But then the sprinklers across the lawns began to slow. The steady hiss of water softened, the arcs fell shorter, and then the sprays stopped altogether. The children in the pool screamed in confusion as the jets along the sides cut off midstream, leaving silence where water had roared only moments before. Within minutes, the grand fountain groaned and shuddered, the final trickle of water splashing weakly before it too ran dry. The entire community fell silent, staring at the sudden stillness. "What's happening?" a woman asked nervously. "Why did everything stop?" Richard slammed his glass down, his face turning red. "It's a malfunction. Get maintenance here now." Davis scrambled for his phone, shouting into it. "Check the pumps. Check the main lines. Get it running again. Do you hear me?" Linda flipped through her ledger, her voice sharp and panicked. "This can't be right. The usage reports are normal. There's no break in the system. Nothing should have failed." But the truth spread quickly. Residents ran to the trenches in their yards, digging at the dirt where the pipes had been buried. When they cracked them open, they found only emptiness, dry, hollow lines where water should have flowed. Panic rippled through the crowd. "There's no water. The pipes are dry. How can this be?" Richard stormed into the street, shouting at everyone and no one. His voice carried, but his authority had already begun to crumble. "It's temporary. Do you hear me? We will fix this." But his words fell flat as the heat of the sun bore down and the silence of the dry sprinklers pressed heavy on the neighborhood. Across the street, the man stood at the edge of his porch, his arms crossed, his face calm. He watched quietly as chaos unfolded, neighbors gathering, voices rising in anger and fear. They had grown used to the HOA's control, to the fountains and the pools, to the pride that came with having water whenever they wanted. Now they stood helpless, looking at the dry pipes as though the ground itself had betrayed them. Whispers began to spread. Could he have done this? He was so calm when they cut his land. What if he controls the water? The man did not answer. He did not confirm, he did not deny. He simply watched, his silence louder than any boast. Richard's face twisted in rage as he noticed him standing there. He stormed across the street, his voice sharp and shaking. "You! This is your doing, isn't it? You sabotaged us. You think this makes you powerful? Do you think this makes you the winner here?" But before the man could even respond, another voice cut in. One of the neighbors shouted, "If it was sabotage, why do you look so nervous, Richard? Shouldn't you have control? Isn't that what you promised us?" Murmurs of agreement spread quickly. Faces turned toward the board, not the man. Doubt spread like wildfire. The HOA, once untouchable, was now on shaky ground. The man said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. The truth was already working its way through the crowd, turning suspicion into certainty. As the sun beat down harder and the lawns began to wilt, the fountains stood dry, and the pool shimmered half-empty, the HOA's empire cracked in front of everyone. Their pride had been built on stolen water. And now, with a single unseen move, it had been taken away. The man turned quietly and walked back inside his house, leaving Richard shouting at a crowd that no longer believed him. Behind closed doors, he sat at his table, pulled open his drawer, and looked once more at the legal documents with his name stamped across the top. The source was his. And now, so was the silence that drowned the HOA. The neighborhood was no longer the same. Once it had been a place of fountains and green lawns, a place where the board walked with their heads high, issuing orders and fines without fear. Now it was a place of dust and silence. The fountains stood cracked and dry, their stone basins filled with leaves. The resort pool, once the pride of Richard's speeches, sat half-empty, its blue tile stained, its surface coated in dirt. Lawns turned brown, sprinklers stood useless, and the air was filled with the smell of heat and decay. People no longer whispered about the HOA's power. They whispered about its failure. And every whisper was like a knife in the board's pride. Richard walked through the streets with his suit jacket off, sweat soaking his shirt, his voice hoarse from shouting. He went door to door, promising the water would return, insisting it was only a technical problem. But the people no longer believed him. They closed their doors in his face, their eyes cold where once there had been fear. Davis stormed through the clubhouse, throwing papers across the floor, his rage uncontrollable. "It doesn't make sense," he shouted to Linda. "The lines are intact. The system is perfect. There is no leak." Linda sat pale at her desk, her clipboard forgotten. She had checked the bank accounts 3 times that morning. They were empty, completely drained. All their funds, fines, fees, savings, frozen under investigation. The HOA was powerless, broken from both ends. Without water and without money, they had nothing. At the edge of the neighborhood, the man stood at his porch, his arms folded, watching the chaos play out across the streets. Neighbors looked toward him now not with fear, but with quiet respect. They knew, even if he had never spoken it aloud, he was the one who had done this. He was the reason the fountains were dry, the reason the pipes were silent. He was the storm that had swept through without a sound. Richard gathered the board together one last time, dragging them into the empty clubhouse. The grand chandelier above them no longer sparkled but hung dim, the electricity flickering as bills went unpaid. He slammed his fists on the table, his voice breaking. "We cannot let him win. We are the HOA. We are the authority here." But the others no longer looked convinced. Davis muttered, "Authority means nothing without control." Linda whispered, "And control means nothing without water." Their words hung in the air like a funeral bell. They knew it was over. Outside, the crowd had gathered, homeowners filling the street. For years they had cowered under the board's threats, but now they stood tall, their voices rising together. They shouted for answers, for justice, for the resignation of the entire board. Some even called for charges, for police, for investigations into years of corruption and theft. Richard stepped outside to face them, but the man was already there, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. The two men's eyes met across the distance. Richard's face twisted in desperation, his voice trembling as he shouted, "You think you've destroyed us? You think this makes you the hero? You've ruined everything." But the crowd no longer cheered him. They turned their backs, their trust shattered, their loyalty gone. The man said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. It was the silence of a man who had let the truth speak louder than anger. The silence of someone who had taken control at the root while his enemies only played with branches. Richard's voice cracked as he tried again, "You'll regret this. You all will regret this." But his words fell flat against the wall of contempt around him. No one believed him. No one followed him. No one feared him. The board was finished. In the weeks that followed, the HOA collapsed completely. Lawsuits arrived, investigators combed through their accounts, and the leaders who had once walked with smug smiles were dragged into courtrooms, their arrogance stripped bare. Richard lost his position. Davis disappeared into debt. Linda faced charges for fraud. The empire they had built on arrogance and stolen water turned to dust. The neighborhood slowly began to heal. Without the HOA's iron grip, people started working together. Neighbors repaired their own fences, cut their own grass, and helped each other without fear of fines. The community, once broken under rules and punishments, became stronger without them. And through it all, the man remained as he always had been, calm, steady, silent. He rebuilt his fence where it had been cut, restored the land where the trenches had scarred it. When people thanked him, he nodded but never bragged. He never raised his voice to remind them what he had done. He simply stood on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink over the hills, the dry lake glimmering in the last light of day. The HOA had thought they controlled his land. They had thought fines, papers, and arrogance gave them power. But they had forgotten the truth his father had taught him long ago. Real power lies in the source. And when the source is yours, everything else belongs to you.